Hi everyone, I would like to introduce our project. It's about trauma in the legal system, bringing it at the focus of victims. I would like to start with the definitions of victimization and re-victimization. Victimization is practically the process of being harmed, injured, or made to suffer by another person, a group, or system. This usually refers to the first time that the person experiences any type of crime, any type of abuse, any type of traumatic event. Re-victimization is when a person who has already been in that event, being part of a crime, an abuse, or a traumatic event, experience additional trauma or harm, either from another victimization or from the response of institutions or systems that they supposed to help. Legal trauma can happen during distressing events like arrests, suicide, or court trials. These situations often include fear, humiliation, and a deep sense of powerlessness, especially for individuals already affected by past trauma. For victims, the court process itself can be traumatized them. They are often forced to recount their experiences and probably face their perpetrator or deal with harsh cross-examination. At the same time, professionals like lawyers and judges may experience various trauma, form of emotional harm from repeated exposure to clients' traumatic stories. In therapy, we see these effects show up as mistrust, emotional shutdowns, or difficult engagement, especially among clients who were court-mandated or felt coerced into treatment. It's essential for counselors to understand how the legal system shapes behavior and trauma response. Social justice, power, and marginalization. Legal trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's deeply tied to power, privilege, and systemic oppression. For example, many survivors are blamed for what happened to them, being asked what they were wearing or whether they were drinking. Their pain is minimized, or they are judged for not acting like they so-called the perfect victim. These biases are even more severe for people from marginalized backgrounds like people around LGBTQ plus and immigrants. These kinds often face disbelief or are treated as less credible by law enforcement and ignored. Their trauma is frequently dismissed or questioned, making it harder to access justice and mental health support. As counselors, we must recognize how these patterns of oppression impact both trauma and healing. We are not just working with individuals, we are also addressing the effects of systems that may have harmed or silenced them. Barriers and harm within the legal system. There are many barriers in the legal system that increase harm and trauma. Victims often have to retell their stories multiple times, sometimes in front of their perpetrators. Trials are sometimes public, which can be humiliating. Cross-examinations may be aggressive or accusatory, which can cause people to emotionally shut down. At the same time, survivors may feel unprotected. Perpetrators are sometimes released without warning, or charges are dropped due to so-called lack of experience or evidence. Even protective orders are not always enforced. As professionals working in these systems are suffer from vicarious trauma themselves without trauma training or mental support. These may contribute to re-traumatize people. The counselor's role in trauma-informed care. As counselors, our role goes far beyond just listening. We must use a trauma-informed approach that focuses on emotional and physical safety. That means building trust, advocating judgment, and allowing clients to move at their own pace. We need to recognize how legal trauma shapes behavior. For example, if a client seems bored or resistant, it may come from past experience of being interrogated or ignored, not from unwillingness to heal. Therapeutic strategies like grounding, motivational interview, narrative therapy, and EMDR are helpful. But just as important is our advocacy role, connecting the clients to safety resources, supporting diversion programs, and pushing for trauma-informed reforms in the justice system will be a great area, so we can avoid this type of issues.
The criminal justice system often re-victimizes their victims, whether intentionally or not. And some of the ways that they do that is through law enforcement, the court system, lack of protection, and forensic evidence. So this part of the presentation will dive into that a little bit deeper. When a victim endures a crime and they choose to report it, the first system that they're going to have contact with is law enforcement. And how law enforcement treats the victim and responds to their needs can really either make or break their experience with the legal system. It can either help them heal or it can re-traumatize them further. So some of the ways that law enforcement can re-traumatize the victims is through victim blaming, especially, say, a victim of sexual assault. If a police officer responds with questions such as, "What were you wearing?" or "Why were you out late?" shifting the blame onto the victim, that can make the victim feel like they cannot speak up about what happened to them and that they're the ones at fault. Another thing that law enforcement can do to re-traumatize their victims is minimization. For example, if a victim did not endure any physical harm, then they can tell the victim, well, you didn't experience any bodily harm, so it's not as big of a deal. If the officers dismiss a report and claim it to be not serious or express doubt about the story, that can make the victim feel less willing to report and share their story. Then there's the perfect victim standpoint, which sets unrealistic ideas of what a victim is supposed to look like and act like. And if a victim doesn't fall and check into all of those boxes that society and the legal system sets up for them, then they are seen to be the problem in the scenario. Next is investigation technique. So when officers interrogate victims to get their side of the story, it can come off very aggressive, and it also creates an unsafe space for the victim to truly share how they feel. And if the victim has to repeat their story over and over and over, that can make them feel very, very vulnerable. There's also discrimination and bias. Victims from marginalized communities may be treated differently and taken less seriously. And then a lot of law enforcement does not have any trauma-informed care or empathy. And oftentimes, victims become ignored either emotionally, psychologically, or even physically. And that is no way to start their experience and their journey with the loss that they experienced in navigating the legal system.
I wish I could send this to someone.
If the victim does choose to pursue legal action, the next thing they're going to have to do is go through the court system. And that is a challenge in itself because the court system is very complicated and there's often dismissals and delays. It's a very long legal process, which can make the victim feel like their case, what happened to them, may not be that important, and that is obviously not the case. As mentioned before, when victims have to retell their experience over and over, and especially in front of the perpetrator, that can be extremely traumatizing. Cross-examination and aggressive questioning can be very re-traumatizing as well because they have to reshare very intimate details of the crime that they endured. And especially with cross-examination, the prosecution is going to make it, or the defense is going to make it seem like maybe it's their fault. And that's not fair to the victim. Facing the perpetrator is very difficult in itself, and court systems may not always have support and resources such as victim advocates in place, which makes the victim feel alone through this process. Oftentimes, the offender gets a minimized sentence, which makes the victim feel like justice wasn't provided. And finally, some trials can be public, which can be extremely vulnerable and re-traumatizing as well. Next, we have the lack of protection. So this is a variety of different things throughout the system. So one is a failure to file a report. So there's been many cases where officers do not file a report and they deem it to be unserious or unharmful, especially if there was no bodily harm involved. Sometimes the law enforcement won't follow up on leads, or they won't arrest the perpetrator due to a lack of evidence. Next, we have perpetrators being released on bail or parole without warning. There's been so many cases where a victim, say a victim of domestic violence, endured repeated violence from a perpetrator, and then the perpetrator gets released and the victim isn't told, and the victim can end up suffering even further from that, especially if the perpetrator's goal is to find that person. Next is the lack of enforcement with restraining orders. Restraining orders are great in theory, however, it's fairly easy to break it and there's no enforcement when it comes to it, so it still leaves the victim with a sense of danger and vulnerability. Finally, we have forensic evidence. So there's procedures, for example, such as rape kits, which are very re-traumatizing for victims. And although they can be necessary in providing evidence, that doesn't make the experience any less vulnerable. There's a lack of consent and control during the process often. Sometimes victims feel like they have to go along with everything and anything, especially if they aren't very informed of their own rights. So that can be re-traumatizing. And of course, the exposure and the vulnerability of the situation at hand is difficult to navigate. Victims of all races, genders, identities, etc. can be victims and can be re-victimized by the criminal justice system. However, there are a lot of barriers for marginalized communities. So, for example, there's economic barriers. There is the obvious cost of legal representation, which not many people can afford. And oftentimes there is a lack of access to legal aid, like public defense and financial aid, to get those resources. There's also that financial risk that might come with seeking help in reporting a crime and enduring the legal process, because sometimes people lose their jobs because of court involvement and other situations like that. There can be a language and communication barrier. So, for example, someone doesn't speak English or isn't fluent, and especially when it comes to legal cases, there's a lot of legal terminology, or the procedure itself can be very complicated if you don't have the support and the resources and the understanding. Sometimes there's a lack of translators within the court system or even within law enforcement and other situations. Next, we have cultural barriers. Oftentimes, a lot of marginalized communities endure a lot of re-victimization, as stated before, from law enforcement and through the court system, and maybe they aren't always believed. And so there is this natural distrust of the system and for getting the justice that they deserve. And so sometimes it's easier to just not say anything at all, which is not a great way to live. There's also cultural misunderstandings due to stigma and lack of cultural humility, which is very important because every single person within the system that the victim has contact with should be practicing cultural humility and should be practicing trauma-informed care and sensitivity training. We have discrimination and bias. There are so many examples of racial profiling and policing that occurs every single day within our system. And of course, we all have implicit bias that plays into how we speak to the victims and how we respond to what happened to them. There's, of course, the geographic challenges. So if somebody lives in an area that is far away from maybe the court system and there's a lack of transportation, they don't have a car, or they don't have the funds to be able to get there. There's also Zoom court, which is now a lot of court systems are doing court cases through the digital divide, and not every person has proper internet connection or has a phone or has a laptop or whatever method that they could use in order to join these Zoom calls. And then finally, and especially in the current climate, legal status can be a barrier for marginalized communities, because right now there's a fear of deportation, and then there could be an exclusion of services for certain communities. So these are just some examples, but honestly, the list goes on. Finally, I think it was important to provide a case study. Of course, there's so many people out there who go through this every single day, and their stories are just as important. But one case is Tracy Thurman. She is a woman in Connecticut, and she was a victim of repeated domestic violence by her husband. The violence lasted for approximately 8 months, and she did try to report what she was experiencing to the police multiple times, and they failed to take action. And so unfortunately, despite all of the times that she had tried to seek help, she wasn't heard. And ultimately, the police failed to protect her because in 1983, her husband stabbed and beat her in front of the officers. That left her partially paralyzed, and the police did nothing for several minutes. Obviously made Tracy pursue legal action, and so she sued the city of Torrington, Connecticut. And the outcome was that the court did rule in her favor, recognizing gender-based discrimination by the police, and she won a civil judgment, and the case speaks legal reforms nationwide. This led to the Thurman Law, which some people may have heard of, which requires police to respond seriously to domestic violence, regardless of the victim's gender or marital status, which seems like common sense, but unfortunately it was not in this case, and Tracy Thurman had to suffer the consequences of that. So this is just one example, but
In this part of the presentation, we will talk about counseling context. Understanding legal system trauma. Trauma in the legal systems happens when people go through distressing experiences like arrest, court hearings, incarceration, or even child custody cases. These events often involve fear, helplessness, and a loss of control, especially for those from marginalized backgrounds. People impacted by legal trauma may already carry other forms of trauma, and going through the legal system can trigger or worsen their mental health struggles. As a counselor, it's important to recognize that legal trauma doesn't just affect a person during court, it can impact how they show up in therapy too. How legal trauma shows up in therapy. Clients may come into therapy feeling guarded, anxious, or unwilling to trust authority figures, including the counselor. Common reactions include emotional shutdown, anger, mistrust, hypervigilance, and difficulty feeling safe in the session. For those who were forced into therapy by court order, it may take longer to build rapport between therapy because it doesn't feel like a choice. Understanding how legal system has shaped the client's behavior helps counselors to avoid misjudging or labeling these reactions as resistance or non-compliance. Counseling with a trauma-informed lens. A trauma-informed approach focuses on emotional and physical safety, transparency, and giving the client a sense of control. This means avoiding judgment, being consistent, and explaining the counseling process clearly. Building trust slowly and respecting the client's space is key, especially when they have been in environments where they felt powerless. Being trauma-informed also includes being culturally sensitive and recognizing how race, immigration status, and gender identity may influence their legal experiences. Strategies, skills, and interventions. Grounding techniques like deep breathing or sensory focus help clients feel safe in the moment. Narrative therapy allows clients to reframe their story and feel empowered. Motivation interviewing is useful with court mandating clients who may not be fully ready to engage. Evidence-based approaches like CPD, ACT, and seeking safety are helpful in addressing trauma symptoms. Counselors should also be ready to help with safety planning, especially for those facing violence or re-entry after incarceration. The counselor's role and ethical awareness. Counselors working with justice-involved clients need to be aware of legal and ethical limits like mandating reporting or documentation for the court. Clear boundaries and honest communication help maintain trust, especially in court-involved cases. Part of our role is also being an advocate, connecting clients to resources, supporting diversion programs, or speaking up for trauma-informed changes in the system. Ultimately, understanding trauma in the legal system helps us offer care that heals instead of unintentionally re-traumatizing our clients. Key takeaways. The legal system can be a major source of trauma, especially for people who have experienced arrest, court incarceration, or forced family separation. Clients impacted by legal trauma often come to therapy with mistrust, fear, and emotional shutdown, which may not always be obvious at first, but it can always show up later. Being trauma informed means creating a space that feels safe, respectful, and non judgmental. Counselors should use specific strategies like grounding, narrative therapy, and motivational interviewing. Understanding the legal context also help counselors manage ethical responsibilities. Counselors can play a powerful advocacy role, helping clients not only to heal but also navigating a system that may have failed them once.
With this, we want to conclude with our discussion questions. One will be, how can counselors balance the need to follow legal and ethical mandates, like mandate reporting or court order treatment, while still managing a trauma-informed, client-centered approach? The second one will be, in what ways can counselors advocate for systemic change within the legal system to reduce trauma for justice-involved individuals, especially those from marginalized communities? 3. How can courts and counselors work together to reduce trauma in legal settings? And 4. What role does culture and identity play in a trauma survivor's experience in the courtroom? Thank you. With this,